Is capitalism against does it go against the nature of or the idea of having a family?
Yes, it does. I mean, capital functions like this. Capitalism functions so as to destroy all forms of solidity. It functions so as to stimulate in us a persistent desire for something other. I mean, look at our sexual lives. We're increasingly interested in things that are ever more perverse or strange. And our economic lives, we're no longer satisfied with whatever we have. So what actually happens is capitalism essentially makes you unhappy with what you have. It disturbs your sense of desire. It introduces a permanent sense of anxiety and competition into your life. And in that sense, it distorts all human relationships and makes them, rather than ones of cooperation and mutual regard, ones of very aggressive forms of competition for resources that are meant to be more sort of available but are ever more scarce.
But wasn't the state in Western European countries at least supposed to be protecting us from the negative sides of capitalism?
This is the great story of the post-war years. What essentially happened is the European welfare state, as originally envisaged by the welfare statist left, thought that the welfare state would shelter ordinary people from capitalism and would protect them from the free market. What essentially happened, though, is that the welfare state disempowered working class people by taking away their ability to self-organise, by taking away their ability to work with each other. It atomised working class communities and also in some way prevented innovation. This then means that the left at the end of the 1960s abandoned the idea of a civic society and embraced the state as the sole representative. And this, as it were, is what allowed the state then to flip into supporting capitalism. So now we're in a situation where the left all across Europe, particularly in Britain, believes that the role of the state is to support capitalism, to at all stages let capitalism into the state, and the state always drives markets into local communities. So the state forces local economies to be open to globalization, which destroys local economies, destroys local businesses, and makes people more reliant on corporations.
Is this why, you know, I wondered that more and more often these days you see heads of state in some sorts of unholy and weird corporations with big multinational companies. You have Schröder in Germany. He's working now for Gazprom.
Yes.
Tony Blair in Britain is a consultant for a large financial institution. Sarkozy is you know, having his holidays together with French businessmen.
He is indeed.
Vladimir Putin is one of the wealthiest men in Europe.
Sure.
Is this a sign of what you're talking about?
Well, what's happened now, and I think
an unholy alliance between capitalism and the state?
What's actually happening now is capitalism needs the state to disempower ordinary people's institutions and lives. And what we're actually developing in, I think, now in modern Europe is a post-democratic society. We're creating an oligarchical elite structure where moneyed elites, the elites of industry, cohabit with political elites, and they move into each other's regimes and spaces. So we've now produced what I would call a market state. And the market state really just exists for the benefit of those at the top. And there's very clear economic and social evidence for this. It's very clear that only the top 1% or the top 5% of people in the developed world have really benefited from the last 30 years. So I would argue that what we're seeing is the rise of new oligarchies. It's almost as if the 19th century is returning to the 21st century, where we're going to live in a world where most of us are disempowered, most of us permanently struggle, most of us can't make ends meet, all for the benefit of a very small elite at the top, which is reaping vast rewards.
So we went from the 19th century to the 21st century, basically, in a way, skipping the 20th century.
Well, the golden age for most ordinary people was the first 25 years after the end of the Second World War. That's when, across the OECD, workers had the highest share of GDP. When that, as it were, ground to a halt and liberalisation set in the 70s, from there on has been a persistent downward pressure and erosion of the living standards of ordinary people. It's not noticed because they use debt, they use other family members to work, and they work more hours. But that's what's been going on.
But do you foresee the big crash in the States? We've had the so-called subprime crisis. People are talking about the real estate boom will collapse and so on. Do you foresee this, big cataclysm of the capitalistic system, as some are talking about? I would call there is a big crisis of monopoly capitalism, because what's going to happen is, and the subprime crisis in America has now clearly moved into middle-class homes. We've all survived by borrowing off each other. You think my house is going to be worth more. I think your house is going to be worth more. We remortgage our houses and sell to each other. And it's all fiction. It's all fiction because, in a way, all value of things like that is fiction. Once we no longer are able to borrow because of the credit crunch, once we now realise that our wages won't cover the cost of these mortgages, all of these forces will go into reverse. So you can easily see compounded year-on-year 5% decreases in house prices. This actually is really dangerous for the whole of the developed Western world, because it means that people can no longer make ends meet in a very real way. As for those who really are wealthy, they will be fine, and they'll continue to be fine, because they own the real commodities. They own the oligarchs. Gold. The oligarchs and the corporations own gold. They own orange futures, agricultural futures. They own land. They'll continue to be fine. They're not in any trouble, but we'll be in trouble. What can we do, the citizens of the Western world, to fight this or to change the system? Well, what I would argue is that what's actually happened in sort of the last 30 years is that both the state and the market have destroyed civil society, which is our world. And what we need to do is recover... What is civil society exactly? Civil society is something that's not the state or the market. Civil society is the world of you and I. But one story of what's happened is that ordinary people have been progressively disempowered by representative democracy no longer representing us, but only representing elites and selling that to us. So I would argue that we need roughly 5 major changes that we can bring about.